If you want to win those 3 interviews and be an employer of choice and attract and retain the world's best talent, you better build a culture that allows you to win those 3 interviews. Ultimately, culture's the story.
You're listening to the Building a Coaching Culture podcast. If you need to compete and win in the 21st century labor market as an employer of choice, this podcast is for you. Each week, we share leadership development, coaching, and culture development insights from leading experts who are developing world-class cultures in their own organizations. And now, here's your host, J.R. Flatter.
Hey, welcome back, everybody. J.R. Flatter here with Lucas. How you doing today?
Pretty good.
You and I are going to dinner in another hour and a half. That's always fun.
Mm-hmm.
There'll be 16 of us there. Always a great time. All right. I wanted to focus this session on the 21st century labor market. You're a lot closer to it than I am in age. We're both hiring people in the 21st century. We're experiencing that, working alongside people in the 21st century labor market. I just wanted to drill in to some of the similarities and differences or anything that comes to mind about the 21st century labor market. And we tend to think about things in generational perspectives. And there is a lot of that going on, but anyone who's working in this time is part of that market, irrespective of their generation. So I'd like to broaden our conversation beyond just an intergenerational conversation, but I'm certain that it'll be part of that. So what comes to mind when you think about the 21st century?
I guess generally, with like talking about, things used to be this way, now things are this way. It's always kind of like a value judgment, as if to say like things were better in the past or, back in my day kind of thing. But sometimes I feel like we're not talking about like what is the ideal, like, so like just because the labor market looked like X in the past and it might have been better than now, like, was it even close to what ideal we're reaching for now? Like, almost thinking about it from more of like a time agnostic kind of mode where it's like, what do we want the labor market to look like, and how do we get there now,
Yeah, and that dialogue goes in both directions. People of the earlier time, I'm thinking all the way back to 1900. Your mother and I are watching a series that's set in 1907, so it's fresh on my mind. And everybody's in horseback or in a carriage drawn by a horse. And so I bet in 1907 even, they were thinking, man, things are changing so fast and the old ways are being left behind. And the youth of that day were like, my dad doesn't know anything. Exactly the same conversation we're having today, 125 years later. It's actually been happening for thousands of years. A lot of that is that change is real. And, when you think about the good old days, before penicillin, before civil rights legislation, just look at the life expectancy from 1900 versus 2000. It's almost doubled. So something that's a nuisance today would have killed you 125 years ago. We fought 2 very bloody world wars since then. And so in many ways, it wasn't the good old days. There's something about the human animal that is nostalgic. We remember our childhood and how wonderful it was. But we forget how hot it was and how hungry we were and how tired we might have been. Maybe that's a blessing. One of the things we teach when we talk about the neuroscience of coaching is that memory is unreliable. We tend to remember the fish is bigger than it actually was, and it grows every year. So there's a lot of that going on. One of the things that I think that the younger generations are criticized for is completely a function of where the world is today, and that is loyalty. I think that was a nostalgic myth rather than real. when the model was learn, work, retire, if you had a skill, you tended to stay at a job. Your choices were very limited, and the technology advanced rather slowly. I've told the story several times before of a good friend of mine whose grandfather, just one generation removed from him, worked for the same company in the same building, doing the same job for 50 years. Those days are gone. That company's bankrupt. That industry moved overseas. The technology that he was using is no longer relevant. We joke almost every session we get together that Moore's law is dead. The time that it takes for technology to double, it's almost immeasurable sometimes because it's so quick. Version control, versions are gone. We edit in real time. We improve in real time. So what we might have labeled as loyalty never was. And I don't want to be cynical, but I think that's just an accurate description of where we were and where we are. When a young Gen Z sits looking at the future, wherever they might be in their life's journey, the technologies and the skills that they have today, now the model is learn, work, learn, work, learn, work, maybe retire. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, we started with like talking about loyalty, and it's hard to be loyal to even an industry that might not exist in the future, or a technology that won't exist in the future, or organizations and companies. And maybe partially there's this, I mean, not partially, this is pretty evident that there's a big distrust in institutions in general. So, whether it's the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, whatever agencies, like any large institution, even like the HOA, like it's like any
Yeah.
organization kind of, it has this skepticism, like there's something shady going on in the background, or something that they have all ulterior motives. And I mean, I totally see why. I have the same skepticism, but maybe in the future we need to think about improving these institutions instead of just wanting to just eliminate them and go back to, oh, everybody's on their own, where these organizations don't serve us. But originally they came together because people wanted to serve others in some way. So how can we improve institutions instead of throwing them away?
Yeah. Well, that's a great thought. Your brother talks about that all the time. When you go in to help an organization, he's an efficiency guy. You probably know better than I do, helps organizations become more efficient and therefore more productive and profitable. He always says, you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Working. That's why you're here. Even if you're facing bankruptcy, something worked for a long time. And there's a great book called The Innovator's Dilemma that talks about, how do you break out of your success because it's no longer working. It's a common phenomenon that a successful corporation doesn't outlast the founder because of that very reason. This is how we've always done it, and it's worked all this far. Well, you push that too far forward, and it's always going to break down. I think another reality of the global labor market, or the 21st century global labor market, is the fact that it is global. We've been experimenting for a long time with outsourcing, with measured success, good and bad, for various reasons. But the labor market now is far beyond outsourcing, to the point of, in many professions, it doesn't matter where you are. Technology, cultures of organizations will allow you to be anywhere. I just talked to a guy yesterday that works for a customer in Washington, D.C. at a very high level in the organization, yet lives physically in New Mexico, which is 2,000 miles away. And he's not the exception. That's the rule now. Is our culture keeping up with that, or our business processes keeping up with that? And actually, are we encouraging and supporting that sort of global labor market? And it doesn't necessarily have to be global, just geographically separated. Do you need that person in the same room? I know as we hire people, a lot of people are stating in their resume without any prompting, only looking for virtual opportunities. And if you say absolutely no, that's going to really restrict. And especially the thinner the margins are in your profession, the more it's going to restrict you because you're very price sensitive. So I ask a lot of people that I coach with, is this existential? Like the life of the business depends on it? Or is it annoying? And I think in that case, most often it's just annoying. What do you mean you don't want to come to work? Everybody comes to work. You think of the lost productivity and commuting, funds to commute, people subsidize commutes one way or another.
A trend that I'm seeing, and I'm not sure if this is, kind of been bubbling in the background for a long time, but it's almost like the business itself might be completely decentralized, where it's like, I have a product that gets developed in China with custom box, and then it could ship directly to this drop shipping idea where I might just take an existing product and rebrand it and then ship it on demand. So in that case, my manufacturer or the designers, the people shipping the product, like everything could be completely separate. And I'm using all these kind of little microservices to get my product to people. And I feel like it could even go further in that direction. You even experience like maybe this department in this organization, like the accounting department is outsourced, or the IT department is outsourced. So I guess to just wrap up this thought, like, do you think that like that's kind of the trend that we're going towards, where the organizations are really, really even more decentralized?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a trend globally, not just individual workers, but individual functions of the workforce. It's different when you're building cars, and even in car manufacturing, just in time manufacturing has been the norm for quite a while. The engine shows up hours before it gets bolted into the car, as does every other component, because there's a cost of inventory. But I think when you broaden that idea to the entire labor market, the right person on the right task at the right time, and then they go their way. This theme, I think, goes right into the gig economy. I often hear it called portfolio careers, where you don't work for anyone, you work for many people, delivering your particular skill or skills. There's a lot of drivers behind that. A lot of it's personal. I don't want to rely on some large global organization for my well-being. I want to rely on myself. I'm a lifelong learner, and if I plug into a single job, it's going to flatten my growth. Yeah, so I think there's the gig economy, the portfolio careers that it creates, I think is here to stay. And again, if we are trying to become an employer of choice in this hyper-competitive global labor market, we better be thinking about these things.
Yeah, like I think maybe just like we say, like AI, this product was not aided by AI. It's like this company, like we actually know each other and we work together, and there's something to that. Like I could see where even if I was really successful in developing a product, but like I'm the only person, in the organization that's hands on with it, everyone else is doing like a piecemeal part of it. I don't have an organization of people that are like champions for the product. And maybe that becomes, now it's more difficult for me to reach a target audience. Like there's something to be said that, X amount of people all work together to accomplish this goal and they were all invested in it.
Yeah, and I think task organizing for projects gets towards what you're describing, or even programs, right? So you might not sign my tax form, but I'm here every day contributing to this team. You can still build a culture, and you should build a culture of what you're describing. So the fact that you're not signing their tax form and doing their payroll is somewhat separate from, are we a strong team? And that's a huge change in mindset. So they're not physically here, and now they don't even work for me in the traditional sense. Why would I invest in building a culture or a sense of teamwork? Well, it's absolutely in your best interest to do that in the short term and in the long term.
It's like you have to market to the people that are, helping you build the product. It's like that message. I guess you're going to build that message externally if you're selling to other people, but maybe you have a similar message that says like, we're all on the same team, we're working together.
I think it's a good example of that is Apple, and their culture seems to be really strong. I've never worked for Apple, so I'm an outsider looking in. And they don't build phones. They design them.
Designed in California.
They market them.
Made in China.
I have never researched this, but I suspect there are dozens of suppliers of different resources to make that phone. So the most successful company in the world right now, from a revenue perspective, that they've embraced this idea and been quite successful at it and have built a pretty strong culture around it.
I guess like a negative example, like Uber and the way that the relationship they have with the drivers, it's kind of adversarial sometimes, but maybe those gig economy companies are like, yeah, I guess they're pretty much what I've been hinting at and describing. It's like, do any of those have really strong cultures that we should look at, I guess?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, I've never driven for Uber, but I've taken a lot of Ubers. And oftentimes the drivers will talk to you about their experiences. I don't want to put my economics hat on, but there's something that's drawing them to that profession. It's an entirely voluntary role. And as human beings, we tend to complain. I was just complaining to you about my experience with Hertz, and they don't have a good customer experience. Every time I call them, it's hours of investment to solve a challenge, but I still keep renting from them. Yeah, that's an interesting thought about who could we study in the gig economy. I have an Upwork account. And if you're in the gig economy, you have to find a way to get yourself out there if it's more than word of mouth. And, the way the market's working, so look aside from the labor market, but just look at the market with the generation and availability of information now, hoping that you can communicate your message to someone and they will come to you is fading because they're finding you. If they have a problem, they're finding you. And if you interest them, then they're going to reach out. But the days of caveat emptor, buyer beware. Now it's provider beware because the consumer has so much information. So when somebody comes to you and sits in front of you at an interview, you have their resume, you listen to them talk. How are you making your decision to say yes or no to them? I'm genuinely asking you.
When somebody's interviewing,
Yeah, for a job that you have open.
like, how do I make that decision?
Yeah. I'm asking you to be a little bit vulnerable here.
Yeah, I mean, you would say like for a technical interview, oh, it's all objective. Like, are they good at X, Y, Z? For me, it's more like you've described in the past. Like when I'm trying to solve a problem, it's all about defining the problem. So if they can look at a problem and describe their approach and describe how that differs from other approaches. It goes a long way to tell me that they do have those objective technical skills, but also that, you know, my technical skills might only work if this condition is met, and then this condition is met, and this condition is met. And, you know, you're coming to a whole new organization where all of those things are changed. So I'm looking for the ability to think about problems in a more generic sense and be able to solve problems and unexpected variables. So I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does. I got a couple more. How did they find you? How did they show up at the interview? What's that process look like?
Usually, in my experience, they've applied, they've found the job either like through like LinkedIn or Indeed, and they might have had like an HR style interview before.
So there's at least 3 opportunities for them to interview you before you ever get to interview them. So they saw the job announcement, or a friend said, "Hey, there's a job opening here at Flatter. You might want to look at it." And they go do their homework about you. Who are you? What are you doing? Try to find out what your culture is like. Are you legitimate business? Are you going to take care of them? And then HR does a check, a compliance check. Do you have the degree? Are you a citizen? Et cetera, if that's a necessity. And then on the third level, they're sitting virtually or in person with you, and they're checking you out. Like, do I want to work with this guy? So that's what I mean by, the market has changed such that 50 years ago, you were the holder of this scarce resource called a job, and you set all the rules. You want to work here, this is how you're going to dress, this is how you're going to speak, this is what time you're going to show up, this is your desk, here's your phone. Well, not 50 years ago, but you probably had one on your desk. And now all that's changed. And you might want to fight that and resist that. If you want to win those 3 interviews and be an employer of choice and attract and retain the world's best talent, you better build a culture that allows you to win those 3 interviews. Ultimately, culture is the story that they're going to tell themselves about your company. Do I want to work here? Is it going to give me purpose? Am I going to get paid competitively? Am I going to have time to hike and fish and bounce my new baby on my knee? Have date nights? Whatever it is you want to do out of work. Ultimately, am I going to be able to achieve my life's purpose, which is probably very personal, tangentially at best is professional.
I guess to just try to bring it all home, we talk about the organizations changing going into the future, the difference between the relationship of employer and employee now versus in the past and what it might look like in the future. But it's this human connection trying to communicate, this is the experience you might have spending time with these other humans. So bringing it back to just this coaching culture of trying to see the human, see the full person, find out about them, be curious about them. I think that's something that's going to supersede all these changes and things that are, humans remain constant or I don't know if I would say constant, but humans remain more or less constant. So if we're valuing them and treating them as such, then it should be, a lasting strategy.
Yeah, good thought. And one thought came to mind as you were talking, and that is this idea of existential or annoying. On our side, as the employer, there are some existential must-haves. We say a lot, hire to attitude and train to skill. But there are some skills that you want or need people to show up with day one. Culture, there might be some cultural, existential. If you're working in certain industries, what does that industry expect of you? Maybe a uniform. But that existential list should be relatively short, because everything you say I must have when I'm on the other side of the interview is some freedom that you've taken away from me. And if it's not an existential freedom, it probably shouldn't be on the list. But there are existential realities, and it's up to you, the person with the job, to identify them and enforce them. Again, I would caution you, make sure they are existential and not simply annoying. All right, my friend, see you in a couple hours. Well, that concludes this episode of Building a Coaching Culture. I truly hope that this episode was helpful to you. If it was, be sure to follow us wherever you listen to podcasts. Maybe stop and give us a rating or a review, and share this podcast with someone who might find it helpful as well. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.